Manny Man Does History. Since medieval times, Ireland had been under English control. Many wars and rebellions from the Gaelic Irish were fought, but England steadily grew in power. Since 1297, there was a British Parliament in Ireland, which sort of took care of Irish business, but as Republican ideals spread from the American and French revolutions, Theobald Wolfetone of the United Irishmen led a rebellion in 1798 to create an Irish Republic, but they failed. After this, Parliament was taken away from Ireland and ruled directly from London, as part of the United Kingdom. Inaction and neglect from the British government during the potato famine in Ireland led to millions of Irish people dying of starvation and disease, while millions more emigrated, ultimately halving the island's population by the 1890s. The Republican movement had received a tricolour from France in 1848, symbolising a Republic of Ireland, peace between its people, Catholic and Protestant. The Irish Republican Brotherhood emerged during the 19th century, and they wanted an Irish Republic. This mixed well with the Gaelic revival, a re-emergence of old Gaelic culture and language in Ireland. The Irish Home Rule movement gained traction in the British Parliament. In Ireland, Arthur Griffith set up the party Sinn Féin in 1905, which meant we ourselves, believing that Irish members of Parliament should not go to London and establish an Irish Parliament in Dublin, comparing it to the two parliaments of Vienna and Budapest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Home Rule gained loads of support during the 1910s, but not in Ulster, which was predominantly Protestant and Unionist, loyal to Britain. Most of Ireland's industry was centred in Ulster at that time, and they didn't want a parliament in Dublin, believing it would be run by the Catholic Church. They threatened war, forming the Ulster Volunteers. In response, the Irish Volunteers formed, and Ireland was on the brink of civil war. A young poet and teacher named Patrick Pearse moved up the ranks of the Irish Volunteers and joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He was inspired by mythological hero Cuchulainn and Irish Republican heroes Wolfetone and Robert Emmet, all of whom died in the defence of their ideals. The Dublin lockout of 1913 saw socialist leader James Connolly come to prominence in setting up the Citizens' Army in Dublin to protect the workers on strike. In 1914, Home Rule was voted into Parliament, but an Austro-Hungarian Archduke was shot in Sarajevo, sparking off the First World War. Home Rule was put on hold till after the war. At this point, there was a split in the Irish Volunteers. Most believed that they should go off and fight for the freedom of small nations and come back as a fully trained army for Ireland. Others, such as Thomas Clarke, believed that now was the time to strike while Britain was distracted by the war in Europe. In 1915, at the funeral of Fenian leader Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, Patrick Pearse gave a rousing speech saying how Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. The older Fenian leaders chose him to speak as he represented the young, new generation of Irish republicanism. Connolly thought the Irish Volunteers weren't concerned with the working people, and he even threatened to send his Citizens' Army up against the British in 1916. The IRB swooped in, talked him down, and coaxed him into joining them as they continued their plans. The Irish Women's Council, Cumann na mBan, who were akin to the suffragette movement, were also brought into the fray. The plan for the rising was for regiments of Irish volunteers to parade on Easter Sunday throughout the country, a totally acceptable cover story for the British, but once in place, they would capture strategic spots and hold the country, forcing Britain to relinquish control while it fought in the trenches. All of this was kept secret from Owen MacNeill, the leader of the Irish Volunteers, who thought it was crazy to go up against the highly trained, highly armed British Army. Another IRB member, Bulmer Hobson, who was against the rising, was kidnapped on Good Friday and held until the rising got underway. MacNeill was all set to call off the rising, but was told about the IRB securing weapons from Germany. but the German ship carrying the weapons was captured before it could land. When McNeill found out, he sent a countermanding order throughout the country, stopping volunteers from doing anything on Easter Sunday. The IRB leaders decided to go ahead with the rising anyway on Easter Monday at noon, but it was difficult to send word out to the rest of the country at such short notice. The conflict thusly would be mainly centred around Dublin. They drafted and signed the Proclamation of Independence, proclaiming an Irish Republic with Patrick Pearse as its president. Easter Monday came, and the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizens' Army gathered at Liberty Hall and marched on Sackville Street. Their target was the General Post Office, which would be their main headquarters, cutting off the main station of wireless communication. They captured the GPO, and Pearse stepped out in front and read the proclamation, declaring the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. At this time, many people didn't know what was going on. Many Irish people were quite happy with the status quo of being part of Britain. As far as they were concerned, the fighting should be happening out in France. The Irish battalions were sent to various strategic buildings in the city to try and hold the city centre for as long as possible. An attempt was made to capture Dublin Castle, the British headquarters in Ireland. It was here the first shot was fired, and the unarmed Constable O'Brien was shot dead. The castle gates were closed, and the rebels fell back to the adjoining City Hall, despite Dublin Castle being painfully undermanned at the start of the rising. None of the major train stations or ports were captured, which allowed for the eventual arrival of British reinforcements. As chaos descended upon the streets of Dublin, the Dubliners themselves, who lived in some of the poorest conditions in Europe, began looting the shops. Martial law was declared, and Brigadier General Lowe took charge of the forces in Dublin. When he arrived, there were just over 1,000 British troops in Dublin. He housed the troops in Trinity College and set up artillery aimed at the rebels. British forces set up barricades out of anything they could find throughout the streets to prevent the movement of Irish troops. They relied heavily on artillery bombardment rather than direct assaults, giving the rebels nothing to shoot at. Messages were sent between the Irish forces via little boys and women on bikes. Francis Sheehy Skeffington, a pacifist trying to stop looters, was arrested by the British and executed the next morning for no apparent reason. Late Tuesday night, British reinforcements landed at Kingstown Harbour and on Wednesday began to march on the city centre. As they walked past the RDS, they were applauded by Dubliner civilians, but things changed as they approached the Grand Canal. Eamon de Valera had captured Boland's Mill, and his soldiers had taken up positions aimed up Northumberland Road, defending Mount Street Bridge. The British soldiers marched endlessly into the line of fire as the bodies piled up until the volunteers were out of ammo, and the British eventually got grenades. The British gunboat Helga came up the Liffey and demolished Liberty Hall. On Thursday, while seeing to the troops in front of the GPO, James Connolly was hit in the leg by a ricocheting bullet. He was unable to walk for the rest of the rising. Along North King's Street, while trying to advance against rebel positions, British soldiers burrowed through civilian houses, killing a few accused of being rebels. General Sir John Maxwell was sent from London with reinforcements. By Friday, there were over 16,000 British soldiers in Dublin. Sackville Street was ablaze from all the shelling. As the flames closed in on the GPO, Pearse called a retreat to the Williams and Woods factory on King's Inn Street, but they became entrenched in the buildings of Moore Street. During the retreat, the O'Rahilly was shot dead, the only rising leader to be killed during the fighting. The centre of Dublin had been greatly destroyed, the first European city since the Napoleonic Wars to suffer such destruction. Many innocent civilians were caught up in the attacks and killed. The civilian casualties during the rising was much greater than military casualties. As the civilian death toll rose, Pearse and Connolly decided to surrender. Nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell was sent out with a white flag. Pearse then officially surrendered to General Lowe. The message spread, and the other Irish battalions around the city stood down. As the women of Come On the Man surrendered, some British authorities said that they could just go home. The women insisted on being arrested with their Irish brothers in arms. The courts-martial for the leaders would be in Richmond Barracks under General Blackadder. Yes, that was actually his name. Maxwell thought he would make an example of the rebel leaders and sentence them to death. The executions began on May 3rd in Kilmainham Jail and continued into the following week. Pearse was executed on the first day, Connolly on the last. Some military leaders, such as Eamon de Valera, avoided execution. Thousands of people were arrested, many not having anything to do with the rising. Seeing the harsh response by the British and the relentless executions of the leaders, many Irish people began to believe these men died for something: an Irish Republic. British Prime Minister H.H. Asquith arrived in Dublin, concerned at the rate of the executions so soon after the rebellion, and called a stop to further executions. In Cork, Thomas Kent, a volunteer officer who had stayed at home, was executed. Roger Casement would be executed in England later that year. Many of the rebels who fought in the rising were sent to Frongoch internment camp in Wales. One such rebel who had fought in the GPO was the young Cork man Michael Collins. While imprisoned, Collins rose to lead the rebels in training, deciding that guerrilla warfare such as ambushes, raids, hit-and-run tactics would be more effective than fighting the might of the British Army head-on. By December 1916, the prisoners in Frongoch were released and returned home to stir up support for the cause. In 1917, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George announced an amnesty for political prisoners, such as Eamon de Valera, so they were released too. Many of the public believed that Sinn Féin was behind the Easter Rising, not the Irish Volunteers. So, to match the public image, many volunteers joined Sinn Féin and reorganised it to match the Republican agenda, with de Valera as president. During 1917, rebel leader Thomas Ashe was rearrested, and him and many others went on hunger strike. He died, and more people rallied to the cause. The First World War was still raging in Europe, and the threat of conscription of Irish people led to even more anti-British sentiment. When Irish soldiers returned from the war in Europe, they returned to a changed Ireland. They expected a hero's welcome, but they were shunned for fighting for the British. In May 1918, British authorities arrested dozens of leading members of Sinn Féin in one night. The leaders had been tipped off. Dev chose to be arrested and stir up more public outrage. Collins chose to avoid being captured so he could continue the fight on the ground. As the 1918 general elections approached, the Irish Labour Party chose not to run so as not to split the Irish vote. A united answer was needed regarding Irish independence, and thus Sinn Féin won a landslide victory. Constance Markievicz would be the first woman ever elected to the British Parliament. However, she and the rest of Sinn Féin chose not to take their seats in Westminster, and instead, on January 21st, 1919, they, or at least whoever wasn't in prison at the time, held the first Dáil Éireann, the first Parliament of Ireland, in the round room of the Mansion House in Dublin. They declared independence, with Cathal Brugha as the temporary president while Dev was still in jail. On the same day in Solohead Beg, County Tipperary, Irish volunteers ambushed RIC policemen, killing 2 and stealing a consignment of gelignite. The first shots of the Irish War of Independence had been fired. Volunteers across the country were told to treat British forces as an invading army, and they raided RIC barracks, stealing better weaponry as they went. The war had truly begun. In February, Michael Collins and Harry Boland broke Dev out of Lincoln Prison. Intelligence was key in this war. The Dublin Metropolitan Police had a plain-clothed division known as G-Men who would follow Sinn Féin members and keep track of their movements and activities. Ned Broy worked as a double agent in the police for the volunteers, copying files, explaining the whole police system, and indeed sneaking in Michael Collins himself into the detective headquarters in Dublin so Collins could spend the night going through the files. In Limerick, amidst the chaos of the war, the people declared the Limerick Soviet, a socialist city named after the Soviets, which had taken control of Russia only 2 years before. The people printed their own money, controlled food prices, and printed their own newspapers. It lasted 2 weeks before Republicans and the Catholic Church turned against it. This was a common thread throughout the war, as socialist uprisings were often suppressed by Irish nationalists, or indeed the British. The last thing the British needed was socialist ideas spreading to English cities and crumbling the empire from within. Dublin TD Sean T. O'Kelly was in Paris trying to get some time with US President Woodrow Wilson while the world leaders drafted the Treaty of Versailles. He didn't get too far. De Valera himself travelled to the United States to muster support and money for the Irish Republic, talking to many Irish American groups and raising $5.5 million. He stayed in the States for 18 months, leaving effective command of the war to Collins. While Sinn Féin in the Dáil opted for a non-violent approach towards the Dublin police through mild intimidation, persuasion and boycotting, Collins believed this wasn't enough. He had a group assembled who would become known as the Squad, who would target and assassinate G-men, making it more and more undesirable to work for the Crown. The Dáil became worried that the Irish volunteers were working too independently, and so they were reorganised into the Irish Republican Army, with Richard Mulcahy as their Chief of Staff. In Fermoy, County Cork, after IRA volunteers attacked British troops, killing one of them, 200 British troops looted and burnt the town. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Lloyd George had outlawed Dáil Éireann, but the British government was still exploring the possibility of Home Rule with 2 parliaments, one in Dublin and one in Belfast. Sir John French, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, believed this could work. The IRA tried to assassinate him in Phoenix Park in Dublin towards the end of 1919. In 1920, the British Secretary of State for War, Winston Churchill, put together a heavy-duty team of law enforcers, many veterans of the Great War. Due to the colours of their uniforms, the RIC Special Reserve gained the infamous nickname the Black and Tans, and they were vicious and brutal, often taking reprisals for IRA attacks out on civilians. Tuam, Balbriggan, Thurles and many other towns would burn before the end of 1920. The north of Ireland was much more deeply divided, as the Ulster Unionists were still very much against Irish nationalists. In Derry elections, nationalists had taken control of the London Dairy Corporation. IRA attacks on RIC barracks increased across the province. The Ulster Volunteers arose to defend the Protestants of Ulster. Catholics in the waterside of Derry were driven out, and an attack was made on the Bogside by the Ulster Volunteers and British Army. In Belfast, 7,000 Catholic workers were driven out of their jobs in the shipyards by Loyalists. There would be no surrender. The British war effort was hampered in many ways by Dublin dock workers and Irish rail workers refusing to carry British war materials or troops. Collins's squad's assassination campaign against G-men was leaving the British intelligence network thin, so they brought in their own operatives from England, who would later be known as the Cairo Gang. The Dáil courts had been set up to replace the British legal system, and Irish people began refusing to take part in British courts, bringing the justice system to a standstill. Many RIC policemen left, frustrated with the lack of justice. The RIC gained more reinforcement from the Auxiliary Division, who would gain a similar reputation to the Black and Tans. The British brought in internment without trial, throwing many suspected IRA members into jail unjustly. In April 1920, many in Mountjoy prison went on hunger strike, demanding political status. In August, prisoners in Cork went on hunger strike. Terence McSwiney, Lord Mayor of Cork and elected Sinn Féiner, was imprisoned, so he joined the hunger strike. 3 people died, including McSwiney, after months of refusing to eat. McSwiney's death in an English jail brought much international attention, unwanted by Britain. The tit-for-tat attacks and reprisals continued throughout 1920, and the 21st of November saw one of the most infamous days in the war. By November 1920, Collins' people had been gathering information about the Cairo gang, who they were, where they frequented, and where they lived. Limerick man David Nelligan had been Collins' inside man in Dublin Castle, the centre of British control in Ireland, and Nelligan had helped Collins with a lot of information. Several senior IRA members helped plan a coordinated attack on the Cairo gang. There was to be a Gaelic football match in Croke Park between Dublin and Tipperary on the 21st of November. This date was chosen for the attacks, as there would be bigger crowds of people coming into the city, making it easier for the squad to blend in. Some of the planners, Dick McKee and Pater Clancy, were captured by the British the night before, along with a civilian Conor Clune. On the morning of the 21st of November, under the command of Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy, the squad and other IRA members were dispersed across Dublin with the names and addresses of British operatives, many of the Cairo gang. Most of the targets were in the south inner city. At 9 a.m. they carried out a coordinated attack on their targets, executing 13 British operatives of various positions and wounding 2 others. 2 civilians were killed, 1 other was wounded, as well as 1 IRA man, Frank Teeling, who was captured. The British response was swift and brutal. In the afternoon, the British auxiliaries moved on Croke Park to the Gaelic football match between Dublin and Tipperary. The Gaelic Athletic Association had been warned before the match that British forces may arrive, but they chose to go ahead with the match as it would have caused chaos to cancel the match at such short notice. Apparently, the British plan was to surround Croke Park, disperse the crowd and search all the men as they were leaving. However, upon arrival, shots were fired and the crowd panicked. Some soldiers fired into the fleeing crowd. Some auxiliary forces scaled the pavilion and fired down from above. Some of the Gaelic players on the pitch who had received IRA training knew to drop to the ground amidst the British gunfire. They tried to crawl away towards Hill 60, but one of them, Michael Hogan, was shot dead. Many of the panicked crowd were injured in the stampede, getting caught on barbed wire as they climbed the walls to escape, and indeed many injured themselves as they fell from the walls. British armoured cars awaited the crowd on Clonliffe Road, adding to the panic. In all, 12 people were killed by British forces. Another 2 were trampled in the panicked stampede. These people were Jane Boyle, James Burke, Daniel Carroll, Michael Feary, Mick Hogan, Tom Hogan, James Matthews, Patrick O'Dowd, Jerome O'Leary, who was 10, William Robinson, who was 11, Tom Ryan, John William Scott, James Tehan, and Joe Traynor. Captured IRA men Dick McKee, Pater Clancy, and a civilian Conor Clune were tortured and shot in Dublin Castle that night. This day would become known as Bloody Sunday. Martial law spread across the country. In December, after an IRA attack on auxiliaries in Cork, British authorities set fire to Cork City. Fire brigades were delayed by the Black and Tans and civilians were shot at. At this time, Eamon de Valera returned from America to a country deep at war. Meanwhile, in Westminster, just before Christmas, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 came into law. Because of the strong Unionist presence in the 6 northeastern counties, the Parliament in Belfast would control these counties, which would become Northern Ireland. The Dublin Parliament would control the other 26 counties, becoming Southern Ireland. Both would remain part of the United Kingdom, but Ireland was now divided. Because the Sinn Féin representatives hadn't taken their places in Westminster, the Act was very out of touch with the developments in Ireland. Many people in Ireland were beyond the point of no return when it came to the British Empire. The IRA travelled in flying columns, guerrilla groups ready to attack, hiding from authorities in friendly houses or hideouts around the countryside. In January 1921, British authorities in Dripsey, County Cork, were tipped off about an IRA ambush by a local elderly woman, resulting in the deaths of 7 IRA men. Later, the IRA kidnapped and executed her and her chauffeur. In Dublin, the British patrols began bringing IRA prisoners along with them to deter grenade attacks. Curfews were brought in Dublin, and they began door-to-door searches. Early 1921 would see the bloodiest of the war. De Valera in the Dáil tried to gain some control back on the chaotic war. There had been tensions growing between Michael Collins and Cathal Brugha over the running of the IRA. Brugha was indeed the Minister of Defence, but the IRA looked more towards Collins for leadership. Dev didn't like the hit-and-run murderous tactics the IRA had been employing, so he moved for a more formal military action of capturing the Customs House in Dublin. Led by Oscar Traynor, this was a complete disaster, as they were very quickly outgunned by the British. 80 IRA men were captured, and the supplies for the Republican cause were running dangerously low. In the north, James Craig became the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. King George V himself opened the Parliament, calling for peace on the island. In June 1921, the British government decided to call a truce, not knowing how close the IRA was to actually collapsing. They were at a stalemate, and the fighting had to stop. Lloyd George wrote to De Valera, and they agreed on a truce. The day before it was to come into effect, the IRA killed 2 policemen during an RIC raid in Belfast, sparking huge sectarian riots and house burnings. This would be Belfast's Bloody Sunday. The truce came into effect nonetheless on the 11th of July, and the fighting for the most part stopped. Republic President Eamon de Valera spent the summer arguing with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George over whether Dev would be recognised as the leader of a sovereign state in the negotiations. Dev didn't get his way, and so Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, among others, were sent over to negotiate with Britain. A fully independent Irish Republic or a 32-county United Ireland was never on offer from the British. The negotiations in London resulted in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which created the 26-county Irish Free State, which would become a dominion of the British Empire like Canada or Australia. The English king would still be head of state, and the Irish government would have to pledge an oath of allegiance to the crown. 3 strategic Irish ports were also held onto by Britain for defence purposes. The treaty also allowed Northern Ireland to opt out of joining the Free State, thus cementing partition on the island. The treaty was signed in December, and Collins and Griffith brought it back to Dublin to a mixed response, to say the very least. The treaty was debated in the Dáil, and people were divided. The likes of De Valera and Cathal Brugha were against the treaty, believing it to be a betrayal of the Republic. Collins argued that the Free State would be a stepping stone towards complete independence, the freedom to achieve freedom. Also, a renewed war with Britain was not desirable. Ultimately, in January 1922, the Dáil voted in favour of the treaty, 64 votes to 57. Dev and his supporters left Dáil Éireann in protest. Arthur Griffith was elected the new president in Dev's absence. Because the treaty had to be ratified by the British Parliament of Southern Ireland, the pro-treaty TDs met with their fellow Unionist MPs in the Mansion House, thus forming the provisional government of the Irish Free State, with Michael Collins as chairman. Dublin Castle and many other places of British authority surrendered to the Free State. Up north, sectarian violence in Belfast continued, and membership of the IRA increased there significantly. Tyrone and Fermanagh county councils pledged their allegiance to Dáil Éireann, but James Craig, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, had them shut down by the police of the RIC. Collins assured the IRA in the north that partition would only be a temporary measure. Down south, the IRA was deeply divided about the treaty.
The pro-treaty IRA were reorganised into the Irish National Army. Anti-treaty IRA members began capturing RIC barracks as British troops were abandoning them. In March, things almost came to blows in Limerick as anti- and pro-treaty forces argued over taking control of new barracks, known today as Sarsfield Barracks. Dev travelled around Munster speaking out against the treaty, telling people they would have to wade through Irish blood, through the blood of the soldiers of the Irish government, and through perhaps the blood of some of the members of the government in order to get Irish freedom. Thems were fighting words, and IRA forces met to officially reject the treaty and formed their own army executive of 16 men. In April 1922, they led 200 anti-treaty IRA to occupy the forecourts in Dublin, hoping for a British response and a renewal of hostilities with the British. The next month, anti-treaty forces captured Kilkenny. Violence broke out, but an uneasy truce was held in the Dáil as the election approached. The leaders of the divided Sinn Féin party agreed that they wouldn't split the vote, so both anti- and pro-treaty sides agreed to form a coalition government, whatever the outcome. The election came and the pro-treaty Sinn Féin won more than the anti-treaty Sinn Féin. Most of the other parties were also pro-treaty. Tensions were running high. The British were putting pressure on Collins to quell the rebellion before it started. Winston Churchill threatened to send British troops back over to sort out the rowdy rebels. But Collins decided he would do it himself. On the 28th of June, Collins had the Free State Army point 2 British 18-pounder field guns at the forecourts and opened fire. And thus began the Irish Civil War. It was no longer the Irish fighting the British. It was former comrades, former brothers and sisters in arms, fighting against each other. The Battle of Dublin lasted 6 days. It was like the Easter Rising all over again, except this time it was the Free State forces wielding the weapons of the British Empire. Anti-treaty forces were herded towards the top of Sackville Street. Some escaped the city as Cathal Brugha stayed behind, revolver in hand, to stand off against the Free State. He was shot and later died. The Free State were now in control of the capital. There was a mad scramble for control across the country between Free Staters and Republicans. When the IRA split, there were more for the Republicans. They also had the more experienced guerrilla fighters, but lacked the decent weaponry. Frank Aiken, leader of the Northern IRA, said they would remain neutral, seeing the social divides at first hand. Aiken would later be arrested and taken to Dundalk prison. Liam Lynch had been captured in the forecourts, but was allowed to leave the city to convince his fellow Republicans to stand down. Instead, he became the IRA Chief of Staff and organised the fortification of his home city of Limerick. They strengthened their positions mainly in the south, nicknamed the Munster Republic. Due to the limited weapons, Liam Lynch chose the defensive stance and let the Free State Army come to them. Free State forces captured towns throughout Leinster and even managed to capture Galway with little resistance. Led by Owen O'Duffy, Free State forces captured Limerick after a week of fighting. The same day, Waterford fell to the Free State. The anti-treaty forces were no match for the Free State's artillery. To avoid capture, the Republican fighters abandoned their positions in Limerick and regrouped near Kilmallock. A harsh battle was fought as Free State forces approached, Republican forces using ambushes and 3 armoured cars to hamper the inexperienced Free State soldiers' advance. But they could not hold back the tide as more and more Free State reinforcements arrived. Free State forces were able to mobilise by sea as they landed in Westport. In Dundalk, IRA forces blew a hole in the wall of the prison, freeing Frank Aiken and other Republican prisoners. In Skerries, County Dublin, Harry Boland, right-hand man of De Valera and former best friend of Michael Collins, was shot dead while being arrested in a hotel. Free State forces landed by sea in Fennet, County Kerry, and later in Youghal and Passage West, just outside of Cork City. The Free State were tightening their grip from multiple angles. A massive portion of the Dublin IRA were captured after their plan to blow up the bridges leading into Dublin was foiled. The anti-treaty forces seemed as if they were being routed very quickly around the country. Liam Lynch ordered all IRA forces to go back to the old guerrilla warfare. They could no longer fight the Free State head-on. Things were looking good for the Free State. In August, Arthur Griffith, president of the Free State, dropped dead of a brain hemorrhage in Dublin. William T. Cosgrave became the new president. Frank Aiken led an attack on the barracks in Dundalk, releasing 240 prisoners and capturing 400 badly needed rifles. Forces near Northern Ireland were able to use the border to escape where the Free State forces couldn't follow. Commander-in-Chief Michael Collins decided to travel down to his home county of Cork and try and make contact with anti-treaty forces and sue for peace. While passing through Bailnamla in West Cork, Collins was caught in an ambush and shot dead. His state funeral temporarily brought the warring factions together in mourning, but it was not to last. Collins had been the closest link between the two sides, wanting to bring about peace and forgiveness and get on with running the country. But with him and Griffith gone, the Free State leadership grew bitter towards the Republicans, who simply refused to surrender. Things once again descended into attack and reprisals, sometimes brother fighting brother. In September, members of Dáil Éireann took their seats in their new home of Leinster House, where it continues today. Spoilers. They passed the Public Safety Bill, which allowed the National Army to run military courts or execute men bearing arms against the state. Most of the Women's Council, Cumann na mBan, had chosen to fight against the treaty, believing a republic to be the best vehicle for women's rights. They had already come far in the last 8 years. There were women judges in the Dáil courts, and the 1921 election had seen 6 women elected as TDs. Cumann na mBan led their own attacks against the Free State and were particularly useful to the IRA for gathering information from Free State sources. They had their methods. Cumann na mBan ran creches in Dublin to allow mothers to continue the fight during the day. The Free State outlawed the organisation in October, and the Catholic Church and media began speaking out against these upstart women. In November, the Free State began executing IRA prisoners. The IRA declared they would assassinate every TD who voted for the Public Safety Bill, and started with Sean Hales. TD Pádraig Ó Máille was also wounded in the attack. In retaliation, the Free State executed Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey and Richard Barrett, all of whom had been imprisoned since the taking of the Four Courts. As 1923 began, the Republican guerrilla war continued, burning homes of TDs, burning old big houses of the Anglo-Irish families, the former Protestant ruling class. Grudges were settled, revenge was taken. Prisoners of the IRA were taken out to the middle of nowhere to be executed, and as this continued, the Free State continued to execute IRA prisoners. Alongside this and the depleting weapons, the Republican fight was waning. Public support was shrinking. The Catholic Church had stopped administering the sacraments to known IRA members, and the power of Catholic guilt is not to be underestimated. De Valera wanted a ceasefire, but had no control over the IRA. In April, the Free State killed Liam Lynch and captured many of the IRA executive in the Knockmeal Down Mountains in County Waterford. Frank Aiken, who had already been recaptured, became the new IRA Chief of Staff, and at the end of the month called a ceasefire. He ordered all IRA members to dump their arms and stop fighting. Dev sent out a message to the troops. Military victory must be allowed to rest for the moment with those who have destroyed the Republic. The Free State were victorious. The costs of the years of war had been high. Because the war had ended, 13,000 Republican prisoners who'd been arrested in wartime under emergency powers could now be released, but the Free State held on to them and rounded up more prisoners just in case. William Cosgrave reorganised the pro-treaty Sinn Féin into a new party, Cumann na nGaedheal, and were in government for the rest of the decade. The police force was reorganised into the unarmed Garda Síochána. The IRA prisoners were eventually released in 1924 after many protests and hunger strikes. Dev reorganised his Republicans into the political party Fianna Fáil to oppose Cumann na nGaedheal. Fianna Fáil would later come to power in 1932 with a tense but thankfully peaceful and democratic transfer of power. Cumann na nGaedheal would evolve into Fine Gael in 1933 and openly flirted with fascism. Yep. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael would go on to dominate Irish politics to this day, being two sides of the same coin, power passing back and forth between them. Dev spent the 1930s dismantling the Free State from within, which is exactly what Michael Collins had been suggesting before the Civil War. Ultimately, he was able to end the Free State and create a new constitution, and established the newly independent Ireland, or Éire in Irish, in 1937. Ireland later officially became a republic in 1949. Northern Ireland would remain a part of the United Kingdom, and the sectarian divides between Protestants and Catholics would erupt into decades of violence known as the Troubles. But thankfully, since the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, it has experienced relative peace. A new version of Sinn Féin emerged during the Troubles. The border remains a central question around Brexit as the UK leaves the European Union. Watch this space. Civil war politics, voting between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, still seems to dominate Irish politics. But we'll see. At least they're not shooting each other.
Ba-bum.